Remember when British tea time always came with something on the side? Not snacks chosen carefully, but things that just appeared? Somewhere along the way, the routines broke, the extras vanished, and tea became just a drink. These were the tea time snacks that showed up without discussion, the ones that filled the quiet space between meals. And the first one sounds so basic now, people forget it was once enough on its own. Bread and butter fingers. Bread and butter fingers were a standard British tea time snack throughout the mid-20th century. Present across classes and regions, they were not considered a treat or a meal, but a correct accompaniment to tea, particularly from the 1930s through the 1970s. Their existence was rooted in routine rather than appetite. Tea was taken at fixed times. Something neutral was expected beside it. Bread provided structure, butter provided fat and flavour. Nothing sweet was required and nothing elaborate was justified. The snack existed to complete the ritual, not to stand out. Preparation followed strict, understated rules. White bread was sliced thin, crusts often removed. Butter was spread evenly, never thick. The bread was then cut into narrow fingers, designed to be held cleanly and eaten in 2 or 3 bites. Speed mattered. The bread was expected to be fresh and served immediately. These fingers lived almost exclusively at home, particularly in the afternoon. They were served to children after school, to adults during informal visits, and to guests when something was required, but a full spread would have been excessive. As packaged snacks and biscuits replaced preparation, bread and butter fingers lost legitimacy. They required effort without spectacle and offered no novelty. Once tea stopped being a shared routine, the simplest companion disappeared first. From sufficiency and restraint, British tea time snacks moved towards sweetness and excess. Digestive biscuits with butter. Digestive biscuits with butter were a common British tea time snack from the early 20th century through the 1970s. They occupied a space between savoury and sweet, acceptable at any time of day and rarely questioned. Their existence was practical. Digestives were inexpensive, filling, and deliberately plain. Butter added fat and softened the biscuit, making it slower to eat and more satisfying alongside hot tea. The combination required no preparation beyond assembly, yet felt complete. Consumption followed quiet rules. The biscuit was buttered thinly to avoid collapse, one then eaten slowly to prevent crumbling. Tea was essential, both to soften the biscuit and to manage dryness. The snack rewarded restraint rather than appetite. This pairing lived primarily at home and in offices. It was offered to visitors when cake felt excessive and eaten by adults who wanted something solid without indulgence. As sweet biscuits became fully self-contained and spreads shifted toward novelty, buttered digestives came to seem unnecessary. When biscuits stopped needing improvement, the practice disappeared. From balance and moderation, British tea time snacks moved toward softness. Malted milk biscuits, broken into tea. Malted milk biscuits broken into tea were a routine British tea time practice throughout much of the mid-20th century, particularly among children and older adults. The biscuit itself was widely available, but its use extended beyond eating. The logic was absorption. Malted milk biscuits dissolved quickly, releasing sweetness and malt flavour into tea. Breaking them into pieces allowed control over texture and timing, turning the drink into a semi-food rather than a beverage. Preparation was informal but deliberate. The biscuit was snapped by hand, dropped into the cup, and eaten with a spoon before full collapse. Timing mattered. Too long and it disintegrated completely. Too short and it remained dry. This practice lived at home and rarely in public. It was associated with after-school routines, illness, or quiet evenings rather than social occasions. As tea became faster and less ritualized and biscuits became more structurally robust, this hybrid habit faded. Drinking replaced eating. From dissolution and timing, British tea time snacks moved toward construction. Jam on rich tea biscuits. Jam on rich tea biscuits was a common tea time snack throughout the mid-20th century, particularly in households where cake was reserved and spreads were rationed carefully. The logic was substitution. Rich tea biscuits were plain, firm, and inexpensive. Jam added sweetness and moisture, turning a basic biscuit into something closer to dessert without baking. Preparation required precision. Jam was spread sparingly to avoid slippage or breakage. The biscuit could not support excess weight. Some paired 2 biscuits together, creating a fragile sandwich eaten immediately. This snack lived almost entirely at home and was often made for children or informal guests. It was quick, quiet, and temporary. As pre-filled biscuits and packaged snacks removed the need for assembly, jam on biscuits became inefficient. When convenience replaced improvisation, this practice vanished. From fragile construction, British tea-time snacks moved towards something warm and perishable. Toast fingers with margarine. Toast fingers with margarine were a common British tea-time snack throughout the mid-20th century, particularly from the 1940s through the 1960s, when spreads were rationed or carefully allocated. Their existence was rooted in substitution. Margarine was widely available when butter was scarce or reserved for baking. Toast provided warmth and structure. Together, they produced something filling enough to justify tea without escalating into a full meal. Preparation followed quiet rules. Bread was toasted lightly rather than browned hard. Some margarine was spread immediately so it melted into the surface, softening the toast without soaking it. The toast was then cut into narrow fingers and eaten quickly before cooling. This snack lived almost entirely at home and was strongly associated with after-school routines and early evening tea. It was rarely served to guests and never presented as special. As butter returned to dominance and pre-packaged snacks replaced preparation, toast with margarine lost status. When spreads stopped being negotiable, this compromise disappeared. From warmth and substitution, British tea-time snacks moved towards softness. Split tea cakes with butter. Split tea cakes were a standard British tea-time snack from the early 20th century through the 1970s. They were positioned between bread and cake, acceptable when cake felt excessive but plain bread felt incomplete. Their logic was enrichment. Tea cakes offered sweetness, fruit, and softness, while still functioning as bread. Butter completed them, adding fat and slowing consumption. Preparation required heat and timing. Tea cakes were toasted or warmed, then split and buttered while hot. The butter melted into the crumb, binding fruit and dough together. Delay reduced quality. They were expected to be eaten immediately. This snack lived in homes and cafes, often served to visitors as a polite upgrade from plain bread. It occupied a socially safe middle ground. As packaged cakes became ubiquitous and preparation time shortened, tea cakes lost relevance. When warmth became optional, this snack faded. From enrichment and heat, British tea-time snacks moved toward fragility. Sponge fingers with tea. Sponge fingers served alongside tea were a common mid-20th century British tea-time practice, particularly during informal gatherings and routine afternoon breaks. They were not treated as a dessert and were never framed as indulgence. Their role was secondary, functional, and understood without explanation. Their logic was absorption. Sponge fingers were light, dry, and aerated, engineered to soften rapidly when exposed to liquid. Tea provided warmth and flavour. The sponge provided structure just long enough to justify eating. Together, they created sweetness without requiring plates, cutlery, or commitment. Consumption followed precise timing. The sponge finger was dipped briefly, lifted, and eaten immediately. Too short a dip left it dry and unrewarding. Too long caused collapse. Such the moment between absorption and failure defined the experience. Success depended on attention rather than appetite, making the act deliberate rather than casual. This practice lived almost exclusively in domestic settings and was often associated with older relatives, formal visits, or quiet social rituals. Sponge fingers appeared on saucers, not plates, and were offered sparingly. They were shared, observed, and consumed without comment. Their value came from participation, not satisfaction. As biscuits became structurally stronger and tea-time routines accelerated, sponge fingers lost their functional role. When dipping stopped being normal and snacks needed to stand alone, they no longer fit. From fragility and timing, British tea-time snacks moved towards simplicity without preparation. Rich tea biscuits with butter. Rich tea biscuits with butter were a common British tea-time practice from the early 20th century through the 1960s. Particularly in households where cakes were reserved for guests and snacks were expected to remain restrained rather than indulgent. The biscuit itself was never intended to stand alone as food. It functioned as a neutral base within a tightly regulated eating routine. Their logic was quiet enrichment. Rich tea biscuits were plain, dry, and deliberately unexciting. Butter transformed them from accompaniment into sustenance, adding fat and mouthfeel while slowing consumption. The aim was not pleasure, but adequacy. The biscuit became filling without becoming a dessert. Preparation required control. Butter was applied thinly, often while the biscuit was still cool, to prevent saturation. Too much caused structural failure. Too little defeated the purpose entirely. Timing mattered. Once buttered, the biscuit had to be eaten immediately, before softening compromised its integrity. The act required attention rather than appetite. This snack lived almost exclusively at home and was most often eaten by adults during quiet tea breaks. It was rarely packed, rarely offered to guests, and never marketed. Its legitimacy came from repetition and necessity rather than preference. No one spoke about it, and no one requested it. As biscuits became sweeter, thicker, and increasingly self-contained, buttering them became redundant. When restraint stopped being culturally valued and snacks became finished products, this practice faded without replacement. From controlled enrichment and measured adequacy, British tea time snacks moved toward temperature rather than texture. Bread pudding slices cold. Cold slices of bread pudding were a regular tea time snack in Britain throughout the mid-20th century, especially in households where baking was done in bulk and food reuse was expected rather than negotiated. Bread pudding was not made for a single occasion. It was produced to last. Their existence was rooted in continuity. Bread pudding had already been baked, often from stale bread collected over several days. Eating it cold required no preparation and extended its usefulness beyond dessert, allowing it to function as a snack without crossing into meal territory. Consumption was passive and unhurried. The slice was eaten slowly, dense and moist, with raisins, spice, and fat distributed unevenly through the crumb. Texture dominated over freshness. No reheating meant no escalation into pudding status. It remained firmly within tea time boundaries rather than returning to the dining table. This snack lived almost exclusively at home and was strongly associated with economy rather than indulgence. It appeared between meals, often cut directly from a slab kept in a tin or covered dish. It was eaten quietly, without ceremony or expectation. As fresh baking declined and portioned desserts replaced shared slabs, cold bread pudding lost relevance. When leftovers stopped defining snacks, it disappeared. From density and reuse, British tea time snacks moved toward direct sweetness. Jam on crackers. Jam on crackers appeared intermittently throughout the mid-20th century when bread supplies were inconsistent, rationed, or deliberately reserved. No crackers offered shelf stability. Jam provided sweetness without preparation or cooking. Together, they formed a temporary solution rather than a preferred choice. Its logic was substitution. Crackers replaced bread when loaves were stale, scarce, or needed to last. Jam replaced filling because it required no slicing, no storage decisions, and no immediate consumption. The pairing existed to bridge gaps rather than establish routine. Preparation was minimal and unrefined. Jam was spread directly onto the cracker, often unevenly and without concern for balance. The biscuit's brittleness imposed limits. Too much pressure caused breakage, too much topping caused collapse. Eating required attention and speed. This snack lived exclusively at home during shortages, late afternoons, or between shopping trips. It was never packed, shared, or formalized. No one planned to make it, and no one asked for it. It existed because it could, not because it should. As bread became constant and packaged snacks replaced improvisation, jam on crackers lost relevance and quietly vanished. From substitution and fragility, British tea time snacks moved toward warmth again. Toast fingers with butter. Toast fingers with butter were a standard British tea time snack from the early 20th century through the post-war decades, particularly when meals were separated strictly by function and scale. They occupied a specific position between hunger and restraint, offering warmth without indulgence. Their logic was containment. Toast converted bread into something crisp and aromatic without transforming it into a meal. Butter added fat and slowed eating, but the portion remained controlled by form rather than appetite. The narrow shape prevented escalation and discouraged excess. Preparation followed rules. Bread was toasted evenly, not browned aggressively. It was cut into narrow strips before serving, then buttered lightly while hot to allow controlled absorption rather than saturation. The form dictated pace. This was not toast as breakfast, but toast as boundary. This snack lived almost exclusively at home and was often served to children, the elderly, or anyone requiring something warm, manageable, and finite. It appeared during routine tea breaks, illness, or quiet afternoons, functioning as reassurance rather than reward. It was rarely discussed and never advertised. As tea time lost its formal limits and toast became a vehicle for toppings and meals, so toast fingers disappeared as a distinct category. From warmth with restraint, British tea time snacks moved towards softness without heat. Plain scones. Without jam or cream, plain scones without accompaniments were common in Britain during the mid-20th century, particularly in households where cream and preserves were reserved for guests, special occasions, or weekends. On ordinary days, the scone existed in a reduced form, stripped of enrichment by design rather than omission. Their existence was governed by hierarchy. The scone had been baked, but its completion was conditional. Eating it plain preserved its status as a snack rather than a treat, reinforcing distinctions between everyday consumption and hospitality. Consumption relied heavily on texture. Plain scones were dry, crumbly, and intentionally restrained. Tea was not optional, but functional, used to soften the bite and make eating possible without additions. Dunking was common and expected, extending the experience while maintaining limits. The process required patience rather than appetite. This snack lived at home and at modest tea tables rather than cafes or bakeries. It was rarely sold individually and never advertised as complete. Its incompleteness was understood, accepted, and repeated without explanation. As scones became inseparable from cream and jam in cultural memory and commercial presentation, the plain version lost legitimacy and disappeared. From deliberate incompletion, British tea-time snacks moved towards structured assembly. Cheese on digestive biscuits. Cheese on digestive biscuits was a widespread British tea-time practice from the early to mid-20th century, especially in households balancing savoury and sweet consumption. It was neither novelty nor indulgence, but a practical adjustment within established routines. Its logic was balance. Digestive biscuits provided a neutral, slightly sweet base with enough structure to support toppings. Cheese added fat, salt, and density without requiring bread, preparation, or heat. Together, they created a savoury counterweight within a tea spread dominated by sweetness. Preparation required proportion. Cheese was sliced thinly to avoid overpowering the biscuit, which could fracture under excess weight or moisture. Hard cheeses were favoured for control, while softer cheeses increased the risk of collapse. The combination had to be eaten carefully, usually in 1 or 2 bites to preserve structure. This snack lived in homes and adult tea settings rather than children's lunches. It appeared during afternoon tea, informal visits, or quiet breaks, functioning as a pause rather than a meal. It bridged the gap between snack and sustenance without committing fully to either category. As crackers replaced digestives in savoury contexts and pre-portioned cheese snacks emerged, this hybrid practice lost its place and faded without replacement. From balance and restraint, British tea-time snacks moved toward disappearance rather than evolution. Malted milk with butter. Malted milk biscuits with butter were a common British tea-time snack from the early to mid-20th century, particularly in households where biscuits were treated as adaptable bases rather than finished products. Their logic was reinforcement. Malted milk biscuits were dry, so lightly sweet and structurally firm. Butter added fat and softness, turning a plain biscuit into something sustaining without escalating it into a dessert. Preparation required restraint. Butter was spread thinly to avoid collapse. Too much caused the biscuit to split or dissolve. The snack demanded careful handling and slow eating, often accompanied by tea to soften the edges gradually rather than immediately. This combination lived primarily at home and was more common among adults than children. It appeared during quiet intervals rather than formal meals, often prepared without comment and eaten without ceremony. It was rarely packed, never advertised, and never treated as special. Its legitimacy came from repetition, not branding or novelty, as biscuits became sealed, portioned, and treated as complete products rather than components. The practice of modifying them disappeared. From augmentation without excess, British tea-time snacks moved toward finality. Rich tea, biscuit, dunked until failure. The practice of dunking rich tea biscuits until collapse was widespread throughout Britain for much of the 20th century, particularly during formal tea breaks where timing and technique mattered. Its logic was controlled risk. Rich tea biscuits were intentionally fragile. Dunking softened them just enough to release flavour, but exceeding the limit resulted in structural failure. Consumption required precision. The biscuit was dipped briefly, lifted, and eaten immediately. Waiting too long meant loss. Success depended on attention, not appetite. The act rewarded experience over enthusiasm. When this ritual lived at home and in workplaces, especially among adults, it was social, competitive, and unspoken. Everyone knew the rules, and failure was silently acknowledged rather than commented on. A collapsed biscuit meant lost value, wasted tea, and quiet irritation. Reaching for a second biscuit was permitted, but repeating the mistake was not. As tea-time routines loosened and mugs replaced cups, the ritual lost relevance and disappeared. From fragile technique, shared timing, and mutual restraint, British tea time snacks reached their endpoint. Taken together, these snacks were not indulgences. They were boundaries. Small, warm, controlled moments designed to sit between meals, not replace them. Each one existed to mark time, not to fill it. They vanished not because they failed, but because the space they occupied collapsed. Tea time stopped being a defined pause and became a blur between tasks, screens, and convenience. When rules dissolved, these foods lost their function. And when tea time lost its structure, something else quietly followed. Not just snacks, but the rituals that made them make sense. If you like this video, like and subscribe.